HOA story time with an update, the rental property from heck. During my tenure, I have seen all sorts of weird appeals and issues that we had to resolve, from pond management problems to neighborly disputes. The issue is, this story, however, centers around a specific renter in our neighborhood along with their terrible management company. The main story. At the end of every quarterly meeting that we have for the community, members have a chance to stay back and review issues with the board case by case. Typically, this consists of community members who have fines that want to appeal or settle. This time, however, a regular attendee came in, which, well, surprised all of us. She had never once had a fine, helped with some committees, and had 2 amazing kids, one of which was special needs. This is important later. She sat down and calmly sat down a folder in front of us, and that's when I knew she was serious. Then she began to explain how she needed help from the board with an issue with her neighbor. She described in painful detail about how her neighbor had been digging up and taking her flowers and had kept flipping around the basketball hoop that her special needs son used regularly. She had even installed a camera and had video evidence proof, which she showed to us. Immediately, I became concerned and told her to call the police immediately. She looked down and informed us that she had, and the police told her to go through the HOA first. While that still made no sense to me, I said that we could look into how we could help. She thanked us with teary eyes and left after that. I walked out of the meeting, scratching my head on how I could help without even really knowing what I could do. When I got home, I looked up the address of the neighbor that was bothering her to discover that the house belonged to a renter and the property owner had a long history of issues with the HOA. While I am not really allowed to discuss specifics here, let's just say that the property has had 10 tenants in 7 years and still has some serious outstanding issues with the board. I looked up the property company and I discovered that they owned over 50 houses across multiple towns in my area and had a D- rating with the Better Business Bureau. I contacted my other board members and asked their opinion on the situation while providing them with the findings of my research. One of them reminded me that the management company had sent a representative to the meeting prior and tried to appeal a whole host of fines with the excuse that they simply did not want to pay them. I had honestly forgotten that that was the same house. Not to mention, they also tried to claim that since their tenants did not want to pay, neither should the property company. So we denied all of their requests since they were years behind in many fees and dues. I drove by the property and realized how bad it looked. The grass was over a foot high, there were dog chains in the front, and their flowers were of course immaculate, and the neighbors' houses were missing. I saw the basketball hoop flipped around for myself, and I could not help but let my jaw drop. I could not imagine how that lady felt for the atrocities that she had to deal with having neighbors like that. I took some pictures and drove back. The revenge. I contacted the board's legal consult and asked if there was anything that we could do to help. Since the property ownership company had refused to pay dues and fines for over 8 years since buying the house, we did have the authority to foreclose and then put the house for sale through the bank that had the loan, which I thought was a little strange that corporate housing company would mortgage it given the amount of houses that they owned, but oh well. I did not like the idea of foreclosing just yet, so I set up a meeting request with the tenant. I sent a request for him to talk to the landowner since we were not allowed to interact with renters, and made my list of items. When the next meeting rolled around, the same representative from the company that showed up a few meetings ago was there. He stayed around, and when it was time for his individual time slot, he sat down and calmly asked what was wrong. My VP started with the list of fines and past due payments and asked if and when they planned to pay it. He replied calmly that they had no intention of paying them. I then asked him if he knew that that means the company could lose the house to foreclosure. He looked sheepish for a second and then replied that they had great lawyers since they had dealt with this through other neighborhoods. We tried to reason with them a bit more, but it was clear that they thought they were above the community standards and owed us nothing. So I personally like to wait 10 years before finally deciding to foreclose on a delinquent house, since no account has ever had that long of a history with the HOA, as we're usually able to resolve the issue. HOAs need to use that authority extremely carefully. Since this was clearly never going to be resolved, the board voted to start the proceedings to foreclose on the property. I reached out to the other HOAs where the company held property and found out that 2 of them were doing the same thing. While it's currently an ongoing case, there is a chance that we can also file a class action lawsuit against the company for property negligence. We'll see what happens, but I would love to run them out of business, since all they do is get bad renters, ruin houses, and ignore HOA rules. I also got into contact with our community's police contact and informed him of the flowers stealing and trespassing. He was stunned to hear that the department had turned this lady away and offered to help. She reached out to me a few days ago to let me know that there is now an investigation into the matter and that she's trying to sue him for stealing property. I offered to testify if it ever came to that, and I am sure that she will win. The update. 9 months ago, I posted about a rental property that was out of control due to a poor investment property firm. After a long legal battle, the board was able to prove to a property judge that the land was out of control and was not maintained. We secured a lien of 20% of the home for all of the fines and unpaid violations, and the judge ordered them to be paid immediately. Otherwise, they would face an expedited foreclosure since the property owner was acting in bad faith, and my state has a special process for these edge cases. As of yesterday, the company who owned the property declared themselves insolvent since 3 other surrounding HOAs imposing similar fines on their properties were included in the ruling. We cannot wait to recoup the damages, and we are working our local foreclosure management team to try and help guide the process in selecting a new homeowner, since any party with a 15% stake gets weird voting rights. We're really hoping for a tenant that wants to take care of them and want to avoid another investment company with a poor record of house maintenance. As for the poor homeowner whose flowers were stolen, the board paid for the neighborhood's landscaper to professionally install them after the current renter left a few months ago. The homeowner's property looks awesome, and they've recently joined our social committee to welcome new people into the neighborhood. While I have to keep it very vague, there are also criminal charges being investigated, which will unfortunately take more time to process. While not every story has a happy ending, the diligent work of this homeowner saved the community and others from a terrible homeowner. Always document these issues, since you never know how someone else may be able to help you with it. Do you think this HOA Karen got justice, or what would have you done in this situation? You ever had a bad neighbor? Let me know. This HOA Karen is absolutely mental. It's called "I Had a Rare Encounter with a Wild Karen and Her Weed Whacker." Get ready for this one, man. To set the stage for this interaction with a Karen, we have a friend who we'll call M. Now, M can speak English and hear just fine, but is fluent in American Sign Language and prefers to use that when interacting with new people in public, rather than talking to them, and I translate for them as needed. So M and I were doing a Scouts event called Scouting for Food. We were taken to a specific neighborhood to tie blue bags on the residents' doorknobs. The bags were for them to fill with a non-perishable food like canned soup or cereal and other things that don't spoil easily, and we definitely don't have people pay for them. If you want to put out a bag, you put out a bag. If you don't, you don't. No big deal either way. So M was walking on one side of the street and I was on the other. As we round the corner, I see some movement from out front of one of the houses. A woman with a surprisingly normal haircut was standing in her front yard, prowling like some kind of horror movie killer. My first red flag went up when she spies us walking down the street, going up to each house and tying a bag on the doorknob, and she retreated back into her garage. The second red flag was when she walked back out of said garage holding a weed whacker like a pitchfork. M was on the side of the street that her house was on and hadn't been paying too much attention to what was going on around us. As I begin to walk up to the next driveway, I hear a voice call out loud and brash, like someone trying to play a saxophone for the first time. "Excuse me, young person." I turn around and sure enough, it's Karen. She's standing on the edge of her yard, eyes locked onto me. M is standing a few feet off of her property, not quite daring to walk in front of the house with the crazy weed whacker lady. Realizing that she has my attention, the Karen gets bolder. You are not allowed to solicit in this neighborhood. No salespeople allowed. To explain why Karen was saying that we're door-to-door salespeople is so ridiculous. Both me and M were wearing our uniforms, which consist of red polos, sashes, and jeans. Okay, the jeans aren't uniform, but this took place in the fall, and jeans are comfy. Karen takes a step towards M and waggles the weed whacker. Not wanting M to get hurt, I tried to defuse the situation by saying the obvious. We're not selling anything. This is legal. We're not bothering you. Leave us alone. I turn back around and continue up the driveway. No, Karen shouts. Nuh-uh, this neighborhood doesn't allow solicitors. You're breaking the law. We were definitely not breaking the law. The food bank we were helping with had worked this neighborhood every year for 6 years now. They got the required permits for specialized neighborhoods and sent formal disclosure papers to neighborhoods with committees to keep people from being able to intervene like Karen is doing right now. It's not soliciting because we're not selling anything. I call over my shoulder. Emma snapped out of her daze and is now crossing over the street to stand on the driveway that I'm standing on, where she rapidly signs, "The lady is crazy. Lucky we don't call the cops." Which, of course, just adds fuel to the fire. Karen starts yelling about how we can get arrested for using gang signs in public. Honestly, I tune this part out because there's only so much BS that I can take in a day. I see the door in front of me open up and a guy pokes his head out and gives me a "You okay, fam?" look. At this point, I gesture to Karen and he rolls his eyes. Behind me, I hear Karen ranting. "I'll call the homeowners association and get you thrown out. I'm a part of the neighborhood watch, so the police would believe me if I told them a couple of teenage vandals were threatening the peace and tranquility of our home." The guy in front of me steps out of his house and gives me a tense smile, the kind you give someone when you're trying not to tell someone else off. "You gotta love people," he says quietly to me and M. "Oh yeah, people are my favorite," I say, rolling my eyes as she revs the weed whacker again. "Hey Karen, leave him alone. The last time you did something like this, you were almost thrown off the watch. This guy's my freaking hero." So Karen yells something about toxic masculinity while letting the weed whacker go full blast before retreating to her backyard and turning on a lawnmower. M flashes the man a quick thank you in sign language and I hand him a bag, thank him for the help, and we move along. If you've ever used a weed eater, you know how much it hurts whenever a rock comes up and flicks your leg if you don't have like long pants on. Imagine the string just going around and chopping you with Karen. That's like nightmare fuel horror movie stuff. How would have you handled her? Jeez. Oh, and a lawnmower too? Hope it's a zero turn. I love my zero turn. You ever tried one? They're awesome. There's currently an HOA Karen serving on the board. Since she joined the board in 2021, there's been a high turnover rate of board members. The last year alone, 2 presidents resigned and 2 other members also resigned. I've been a homeowner since 2020 and the only board members I've seen resign were owners who sold their homes. One of my neighbors was bullied to resign by her in 2022. A lot of people support her because she talks herself up like a sleazy car salesman and people believe her, and she also has supporters on the board. This complex has experienced an increased level of crime within the past 2 years, ranging from mail and package theft, catalytic converter and auto, like broken car windows and entire cars theft, abandoned stolen vehicles, and even 2 carjackings. This board member got rid of the roaming security. She reasoned that it's because they did not deter crime. Of all the incidents listed, package theft was the only crime that occurred when we did have security. She constantly advises the owners and renters to not call the police because it'll bring property values down. Every time someone brings up the crime, she either ignores it, berates us for leaving stuff in our cars and not being home to get our packages, or she shuts people down by spouting out incorrect crime facts. For whatever reason, our HOA fees have doubled since I purchased in 2020. When I questioned her about the fees and requested an official audit by an outside company, she flipped out. She went on to say how she's a professor and it took her months and months to get the finances straight. She's a nutrition professor and tries to work that into every conversation. Depending on the condo layout and type, there's a reserve account for each section. The units had the most money in the reserves because we have the oldest buildings. Since she's been in office, the reserve account for the unit section that I live in was depleted to pay for construction issues with the new $1 million condos. She's making the homeowners in our section pay it back. More recently, she tried to hit me with her car while pulling into the motor court where her garage is located. Some of the condo units have a motor court where there's 10 condos that access their garages via one driveway, and it's somewhat T-shaped. 2 cars can drive in and out of the driveway. That's how wide it is. I live in condos that do not have a sidewalk on my side of the street. In order for anyone who lives on my side of the street to walk on a sidewalk, they have to cross the street, the same side of the street where the HOA Karen lives. When I was carrying my dog while walking on the sidewalk about to cross HOA Karen's driveway, this woman pulls into her driveway, not stopping or even slowing down for me. She made direct eye contact with me while she pulled into her driveway. I was so startled that I took a step back. I usually cross the driveway on the sidewalk to cross the street to my home, which I was doing at the time. And I always look because my neighbors are known to speed. I did not have my phone on me at the time. Thankfully, I have Ring cameras on my balcony facing the street. The cameras are motion sensitive, and one of them caught her turning sharply towards me stepping back, and her speeding into her driveway. Ring only saves video for 60 days, so I pulled random days of video from November and December to compare her driving habits. She makes wider turns and slows down. After comparing it and showing my mother the video, my mother reported her on a local website that addresses traffic safety issues. Within minutes of it being submitted, this red-handing bee texts me asking me to come directly to her for issues with her driving and defending her driving. Shortly after, she messages one of the neighbors asking him if he reported it, and then goes on to accuse me of reporting it and claiming that I was walking in the middle of the street. All of this behavior confirms to me that she knows she's guilty of intentionally trying to hit me. I don't want to go to the board with this because they're part of her fan club and enable her behavior. What should I do? What can the HOA management company do? Attempted vehicular manslaughter is a crime. You need to go to the cops, sue, lawsuit, something. This is serious business here, and she's trying to cover it up with our friends on the board. What would have you done? That's not your car, lady. Wow. So this happened around 2008. My buddy Brock had gotten out of the military after 10 years. He'd started in the Marines but transitioned into the Army for the last 4 years before buying a house in Texas. When he got out, he did a variety of jobs before landing a gig with a repo service. He worked there for a year and had a lot of wild stories, but this one sticks out the most as he helped a fellow soldier get revenge on an evil ex. Brock was at the office speaking with his manager, who I'll refer to as Karen. Now, this particular Karen had a lot of Karen-like qualities, but was a force for good, if you can believe that. While they were talking, they see a young man enter the office. They immediately noticed he had 2 black eyes and his arm was in a sling. The young man, whose name I unfortunately never learned but I'll call Ben, asked how hard it would be for them to help repossess his car. Karen called her daughter in, Karen Jr., and had her pour Ben a cup of coffee. Karen then asked Ben to tell her a story. Ben began with telling her that he had just returned from a deployment. He had been dating a local girl that lived outside of the famous Fort Hood, not a good idea by the way, before the deployment. Thanks to a previous deployment, he had managed to get himself a used black Dodge Charger, which was his baby. He further explained that, shortly after buying the car, he had met the local girl, who for the sake of the story, I'll call Morgan. Morgan was always asking to drive his car, but he was always just declined. When he was getting ready for his deployment, Morgan repeatedly asked if she could borrow the car, but he kept saying no. After much needling, he relented, but on the condition that she take care of his apartment until he comes back from rest and relaxation leave, and she agreed. Ben left for his deployment while Morgan took care of his place. When Ben came back for leave, he found his apartment immaculate. He pulled his car from storage and drove to Morgan's. He spent a few days with her before handing her the keys and heading to his home state to visit family before returning to his deployment. He returned again from his deployment and found nothing but trouble. When he walked in to his apartment, he found a layer of dust on just about every surface. It was almost like no one had been there in months. When he checked his bedroom, he'd found his room had been torn apart. All of his drawers had been searched and upturned. He tried to call Morgan, but never received an answer. He located his safe, which was hidden, and found that it hadn't been touched. He then grabbed his spare key from the safe, called a buddy of his, and they went to Morgan's. As they pulled up to Morgan's, he saw a car there that he initially didn't recognize, but as they got closer, he realized it was his baby. Morgan had the car painted hot pink and put 24-inch spinners on it. He tried the key just to make sure, and the lights flickered as it unlocked. While his buddy laughed, Ben went to the front door and Morgan answered. He asked what had happened to his car, and she responded with, "It's my car now." Ben walked away and hopped in his hot pink mess. As he started it, 4 large dudes came out of Morgan's house, one with a baseball bat, and yanked Ben out of his car. They proceeded to beat the crap out of him in the driveway before his friend intervened, pulling his conceal and carry pistol on the group. He then took Ben to the hospital. I'm honestly just not sure if the cops were called in on this. I'd assume yes, but even then, Ben said his friend drove by Morgan's house a handful of times while he was in the hospital, well, at random times, and the car was never there. Karen stared at Ben for a bit before asking for paperwork. Ben handed it to her, and Karen had a smile form on her face. She then asked Ben for Morgan's phone number. Ben gave it, but just wasn't aware of what was about to happen. Karen handed the phone to Karen Jr., who then dialed the number. Karen Jr. then began speaking to Morgan, telling her that they'd met at one of the local clubs and wanted to know if she was down to party that night. Apparently, Morgan agreed, and the plan was set. Brock parked his tow truck at the club and waited. Sure enough, Morgan showed up with the pink monster, parked it, and went inside with some girlfriends. Brock then gave them 5 minutes before he stealthily drove up to the car and hooked it up. As he was pulling out with the pink monster, Morgan walked out of the club. She saw her car in the tow truck and began trying to flag Brock down, but he was already out of there. The next day, it was business as usual at the office when Morgan called. She was furious that her car was stolen by them and wanted it back. Karen, using her best customer service voice, told her that if she had the registration, she could come and pick it up. Morgan began screaming louder that she was going to call the cops, at which point Karen sarcastically told her, "Please do," and then hung up on her. As this phone call was going on, Brock happened to look out the window and saw Morgan standing next to a car in a vacant lot, throwing what appeared to be a temper tantrum. After Karen hung up, Brock watched her get in her car on the passenger side, and Karen then looked out the window and had Brock verify it was her. She then began to smirk. Karen then proceeded to call the owner of the property that Morgan and her friend were occupying. She told the owner about the car and asked if he wanted it towed, and the owner okayed it. Brock then drove his truck over to the ladies in the car and introduced himself. They tried to explain that they were waiting for Morgan's boyfriend, but Brock insisted they weren't allowed to park there. They argued and called him every name in the book. Brock then hooked up their car and lifted it partially off of the ground, forcing the two to exit the vehicle. They tore into him until he showed them the tow order. While this back and forth was going on, Ben arrived at the office and Morgan saw him walk in. She ran to the office door and Brock proceeded to lower the car. When Brock went back into the office, all heck had broken loose. Morgan apparently tried to snag the keys back from Ben, but he pocketed them. She began to hit him in his hurt arm and warned Ben that she'd call her friends to finish the job if she didn't get her keys back. Karen Jr. had already called the cops at this point, and Brock got in between Ben and Morgan, even telling Morgan to try hitting him to find out what would happen. Morgan then tried to play the pity card and said that she only wanted the keys to get her laptop out for school. Karen asked Ben to hand the keys over to Brock so he could grab the laptop, and Brock retrieved the laptop from the car, and as he was handing it over, she rushed to aggressively grab it, but knocked it from Brock's hands. Completely furious at this point, Morgan accused Brock of dropping the computer on purpose and threatened to sue. The cops then arrived and Morgan began her sob story again, telling the police that they stole her car. The police questioned Karen, and Karen gave her casual smirk while asking if they wanted to see the security videos. The police watched and listened as Morgan punched Ben several times and heard the threats that she had made about sending her friends after him. The police then turned to Morgan, who had turned ghost white at this point. She tried to back her way to the door, but the police stopped her. They proceeded to ask about the car, Ben's injuries, and who she planned on sending after him. She initially denied everything, but they already had evidence on her beating him up. She was arrested and Ben got his car back. After the cops left, Ben admitted that he didn't want to be seen in a car that looked like it was advertising Pepto-Bismol and planned on trading it in for a GTO. We later heard through the grapevine that the 4 guys who beat up Ben were arrested. Morgan had ratted them out. What's the old term, Jody or whatever, when you go to the military and then your friend is not so faithful? I mean, you just wouldn't trust her. She's going to rat out the guys who beat him up, and then a tow truck Karen. This is just a crazy suing story. What would have you done? This is my story of how I took down my terrible neighbor Karen for vandalizing my car. I fought back with my lawyer, and what she did was a shock to me. So Karen had always been a neighbor of mine, living just a few houses down the street. We'd cross paths occasionally, but we were never particularly close. I'd heard through the grapevine that she was jealous of my house and the life that I'd built for myself. My home was my pride and joy. It was a place that I'd worked hard to make as comfortable and beautiful as possible. I had recently acquired a new car, one that I'd been dreaming of for years. It was a sleek, shiny, and powerful machine, and I absolutely loved it. Well, as it turned out, Karen had always wanted a car just like mine, but couldn't afford it. She had also been envious of my house, which was bigger and more impressive than her own. Her jealousy became really intense, and she could not stand just seeing me living my best life. Instead of working to improve her own situation, she decided to take a destructive route. How sad is that? Anyway, one early afternoon, I was relaxing in my living room. I was watching TV when I heard a loud crash outside. It scared me to death, so I rushed over to the window. I wanted to see what had happened. My heart absolutely sank as I saw the source of the commotion. There was Karen, standing beside my brand new car, a sledgehammer in her hands. She was slamming it into the car with a primal rage that I just had never seen before. The loud, sickening thuds echoed throughout the neighborhood as she mercilessly attacked my beautiful ride. I could not believe my eyes, and a surge of that same primal rage that she had, mixed with disbelief, coursed through my veins. My feet moved before my mind could catch up, and I stormed outside, shouting at Karen, demanding to know what on earth she was doing. She turned to face me, her eyes filled with hate and madness. Her lips curled into a sly grin, as if she had achieved some sort of twisted victory. "You think you're so much better than everyone else with your fancy house and that car," she sneered. "I can't stand it anymore, so I thought I'd teach you a lesson." In a blind rage, I grabbed my phone and began recording her. She continued to bash my car with the sledgehammer, completely oblivious to the fact that she was being captured on video. In a way, her arrogance actually helped me, as her sinister grin was undeniable evidence of her actions. When she had finally had her fill of destruction, she dropped the sledgehammer and began to walk away, thinking that she got away with her crime. But she had no idea that her wicked deed had been caught on camera. Well, there's more. Once I was sure that she was gone, I rushed inside and reviewed the footage. Her face, filled with malice and glee as she destroyed my car, sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to do something about this. I had to expose her for the criminal that she was. So what did I do? I decided to take the evidence to the police. I mean, wouldn't have you? It wasn't an easy decision, as I knew it would likely lead to a confrontation with my neighbor. And I hate confrontation. I try to avoid it whenever I can because it's just so uncomfortable. But I couldn't just let her get away with such a blatant act of destruction, especially when I had the proof. It did hurt to record, but I knew I had to do it. I walked into the local police station, I presented the video footage, and I recounted the entire incident. The officer on duty was shocked at the clear evidence that I'd provided. He assured me that they would do everything in their power to bring Karen to justice. With the police now involved, I knew it was only a matter of time before they tracked Karen down. Her careless actions had left her exposed and vulnerable, and she was about to learn that you can't escape the consequences of your actions. You can only run for so long, but you can't hide, Karen. A few days later, the police located Karen and brought her in for questioning. She was caught completely off guard, unable to comprehend how her plan had unraveled so quickly. When confronted with the hard evidence, she had no choice but to confess to her actions. I mean, how could you not? She was charged with malicious destruction of property and arrested on the spot. With Karen in police custody, I felt a sense of relief and justice, but the ordeal was far from over. The damage to my car was extensive, and I had no choice but to contact my insurance company to assess the situation. And we all know, dealing with insurance sucks. The insurance adjuster arrived to inspect the wreckage and estimated the cost of the repairs. Unfortunately, the damage was so severe that the car was deemed a total loss. While I was devastated by the loss of my dream car, I was grateful for insurance, which would cover the cost for a replacement. A few weeks later, I received a check from my insurance company to cover the cost of a new car. It was a bittersweet moment, as the car I had loved was gone, and you just can't replace sentimental value. But at least I was getting a fresh start, right? I began the process of shopping for a new vehicle, trying to put the traumatic incident behind me. However, the consequences for Karen were just beginning to unfold. She was facing legal charges, and I wasn't even about to let her off the hook easily. Can you blame me? I decided to file a civil lawsuit against her, seeking compensation not only for the damage to my car, but also for the time and stress that this incident had caused me. I hired a lawyer who specialized in personal injury and property damage cases. He meticulously reviewed the evidence and began building a case against Karen. He was confident that we had a strong chance of winning, especially given the clear video evidence of her actions. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. I wanted to hold Karen accountable for what she had done and ensure that justice was served. My lawyer and I arrived at the courthouse and ready to present our case. As the proceedings began, my lawyer presented the video footage, which left the judge and jury in shock. It was clear that Karen had committed a malicious act of destruction out of envy and spite. The courtroom was filled with tension, and it was evident that Karen's actions were indefensible. There is one very important thing that I have to mention. As the trial continued, it became clear that Karen was nowhere to be found. She had failed to appear in court, which was a huge mistake on her part. The judge issued a warrant for her arrest, and the case proceeded without her presence. The court ruled in my favor, awarding me compensation for the damage to my car and the emotional distress that I'd endured. The judgment also included punitive damages to deter Karen and others from similar acts of vandalism in the future. With the court's decision in my favor, I felt a sense of closure and justice. Karen had been held accountable for her actions, and I had received compensation for the damage to my car and the time that I had spent dealing with the aftermath of her destructive act. The legal consequences didn't stop there for Karen. Her failure to appear in court did lead to her arrest, and she faced additional charges for her evasion of the law. She was ultimately sentenced to probation, community service, and offered to pay restitution for the damages, which were all well-deserved, mind you. The entire incident had a profound impact on Karen's entire life. Not only had she lost her freedom and been ordered to pay for her destructive actions, but her reputation in the community was irreparably tarnished. She had gone from being envious of my life to being pitied and shunned by those around her. Karen's jealousy and spite had only brought her misery and misfortune. She'd underestimated the power of evidence and the consequences of her actions. I had not only gotten a new car, but also the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served. Life went on, and I continued to enjoy the comfort of my home and the thrill of driving my new car. I also made a few upgrades to my security system to ensure that no one would ever dare to trespass on my property again. The incident with Karen would always serve as a reminder that envy and spite could lead to one's own undoing, and that justice would ultimately prevail. Our neighbors took our fence while we were on a road trip. So, we've had issues with our attached neighbors from the moment that we bought our house. Originally, it was just a 60-something female and her 18-something male grandson. The day we moved in, we tried to make small talk and introduced ourselves. The woman was dropping hints that the old owners used to bake her goodies all the time and she missed it, kind of insinuating that we should be like them because she deserved to be treated like a princess. The grandson introduced himself as the worst person in town. What an intro. So afterwards, we just tried to keep a friendly distance and stay out of their way. Suddenly, after about a week of living here, they began screaming at odd hours, blasting music and banging on the walls. The police were at their house for domestic disputes monthly due to the woman calling the cops on her grandson. We've lived here for over 2 years now, fixing up our house and making it beautiful and adding value to it. Up to this point, we've just let them have their problems because it's not like we have kids to worry about protecting, it's just my partner and I in our mid-20s. Fast forward to last month. One evening, after it got dark, we heard what we thought were gunshots right in our backyard. Mind you, we live in a downtown suburb borough with an older person facility right behind our house, so we were a little concerned. We have cameras that we installed just to be safe, so we checked them. The grandson and his friends were sitting in their yard talking about shooting another round. They'll just think it's fireworks, and that's a .45 round. Unfortunately, it was dark and we couldn't see them shoot it, but the camera picked up the sound of them shooting off 9 rounds, so naturally we called the cops. The kids then left, and the cops couldn't prove anyone was on the premises with the gun, so they let it go. In the beginning of August, the woman decided to let her daughter, sister-in-law, and their children move in with them for who knows what reason. Before this, they had only come to visit on holidays, and one time they left their infant child on the street in a carrier for over half an hour until I knocked and let them know that she was out there. None of my business. But from there on, the screaming and the yelling got worse, and this time with crying kids in the mix. I had half a mind to call CPS, but I've heard the awful things that happen to kids in the system, so I couldn't bring myself to do it. This month, we were fortunate enough to go on a road trip to see some cool places and visit family. We left at the end of August, and we were checking our cameras when we had service, which was not much. One day, we get a call from our unattached neighbor saying that our attached neighbors were building a really ugly shed with spare planks from who knows where. We tried not to worry too much because up to this point, their crappy shed wasn't our problem other than an eyesore in the neighborhood. We just enjoyed the rest of our trip and let it go, occasionally checking to make sure they weren't in our yard or anything since it's nicely fenced in and gated. Didn't catch anything on camera other than them building their crappy shed. We arrived home a few hours ago to find out those entitled jerks dug out and stole part of our fence, the metal post and chain link, to create a back fence and gate for their yard. This left huge holes in our back parking area that my partner almost tripped and fell into. They also tied into our fence incorrectly, pulling our fence lopsided and loose, basically damaging it. Unfortunately, our camera didn't catch them taking our fence, just it was in our yard in one frame and in theirs the next. We want to press charges, but aren't sure how to go about it. We checked our seller's disclosure stating that the previous owners of our house had put the fence in, so we know it was our fence that they took. I'm so livid, and I know yelling at them won't fix it, but how can you be so entitled that you can't even buy your own chain link fence, but instead steal your neighbors when they aren't home? Call the police, file a report, and cut any fence tied into your fence post. We are planning to call the borough tomorrow and file a report with the police. We would do that last part, but considering the gunshot situation, the fact that we share a wall with them that doesn't have a firewall between us, and the fact that we know they are violent people who don't want to do anything that would cause them to be violent toward us. Thank you for the good advice, though. It's very appreciated. Sometimes it's hard to think logically when you're seeing red. And then call your homeowner's insurance company as well. Very good idea and not something I thought of. See, you gotta be careful in this situation. You don't want to tick off the crazy neighbors, but you gotta do something to handle it. You could probably lawyer up in this situation. What do you think? What would you do? The HOA president tows me. Your Honor, I'm no HOA member. Click the video on your screen to find out what happens to that nasty HOA, and I'll see you there.